Hi, everybody. My name's Penny Livingston, and I hail from Whidbey Island in Western Washington, the land of the Snohomish people. And the Salish name for Whidbey Island is Tecoloche. And so I'm really excited to be part of moderating this panel, and we have an exciting guest coming. And so I wanted to just frame a little bit with what we're going to be talking about. So what I'm thinking is like as the earth is spinning out of control, with not the earth spinning out of control, but the people, the culture, the consumer culture, the capitalist culture is doing so much to destroy the planet. We have tools through permaculture to really turn this earth ship around and move from a culture of degrading the earth and ecological degeneration to ecological regeneration. And we believe that permaculture has a lot of tools to offer. And I'm assuming most of you know what permaculture is, but it really is a design tool that we can use. We've learned deeply from indigenous people. We've learned deeply from observing nature. We've learned deeply from innovative regenerative farmers and people who have just experimented and tried new things. But we can do this. You know, we got this. And we could turn this ship around. As one of the co-founders of permaculture, Bill Mollison, said, the problems are increasingly complex, but the solutions are embarrassingly simple. And so we can grow food without chemicals and build soil in the process and clean water and stop erosion. And we can rehydrate dry lands and we can clean water. You know, we've got all the tools available, but the question is, do we have the political, cultural, and economic will to do this? And so a lot of the topic today is going to be around how do we scale up permaculture and what are some of the barriers and what are some of the just solutions that we have experience with. And so on our panel today, we thought we have these amazing group. In fact, we have the co-founder of permaculture and in my understanding, the originator of the concept, none other than David Holmgren from Melbourne, Australia. And we also have Maddy Harland, who is from the UK, and Mark Shepard, who is now in Stuttgart, Germany right now at a regenerative climate conference. And so David, he actually wrote the first permaculture book. It was his master's thesis called Permaculture 1. And he's the author of many books, including Retrosuburbia, A Downshifter's Guide to a Resilient Future. And then Maddy is the editor and publisher of Permaculture Magazine, along with many other books. So she's going to be speaking a lot about media. And then Mark Shepard is the CEO of Forest Agriculture Enterprises. And he is the author of a book called Restoration Agriculture. And so welcome, you three, to the panel. And so the way this is going to work is we're going to, each panelist is going to give a few minutes and share some things on their experience and their topic. We'll start with David, then we'll go to Maddy, and then we'll go to Mark. And then, well, after that, we've organized some questions that we can ask throughout the rest of the session. So without further ado, David, take it away.
Thanks, Penny. And yeah, my first inclination is to critique the thinking behind the topic, but I think I'll let that issue emerge from the three examples of scaling up that I've been involved with. Retrosuburbia, biomass energy, and marine permaculture. The last is a very recent collaboration. Biomass energy is a long-standing passion, while Retrosuburbia builds on the first scaling up of permaculture action in Australia in the late 1970s. So let's let's move on to the next slide. And yeah, so Brian von Herzen of the Climate Foundation coined the term marine permaculture to describe systems to grow kelp that can be harvested for food, feed, fertilizer, sequester carbon, and create habitat to support thriving and diverse fish populations. By creating kelp forest ecosystems where none existed, this vision, proposals, and projects are analogous to early permaculture visions of terrestrial forests that would restore degraded land and desert landscapes with species that are able to ameliorate the local and even bioregional climate while providing abundant food, fodder, fuel, and structural material for people. But nature's design rules and limits that define permaculture in the marine environment are quite different to the terrestrial realm. Seaweeds, especially fast-growing and massive kelp species of the temperate climate regions, need substrates close enough to the surface to ensure light for photosynthesis. And in nature, this occurs along coastlines where shallow depth and wave turbulence combine with runoff from rivers to provide necessary nutrients. In the same way that wharves, offshore rigs and wrecks can provide artificial reefs to support shellfish, coral, and associated fish, designed submerged structures can provide substrate for kelp forests away from the coast. With reduced impact of storm surges, kelp growth can be regulated by herbivorous fish that are grazed and harvested, grazing wild, and artificial upwelling of cold, nutrient-rich waters from lower levels. Now, I've collaborated with Brian von Herzen and Scott Spilius from the University of Queensland to use permaculture ethics and design principles as a framework to guide not just seaweed farming, but the blue economy more generally, focused on the resources of the ocean. Now, much of the government and corporate promotion and efforts to develop the blue economy show all the signs of making the same mistakes as industrial aquaculture and agriculture. Through a paper we've co-authored, awaiting publication, we hope to draw in experts in oceanic conservation, marine resource management, mariculture, to support a framework that can hopefully guide fisherfolk, mariners, consumers, investors, and policymakers towards virtuous cycles of regenerative abundance rather than repeating vicious cycles of greed and simplification of nature's diversity. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so I feel much more at home in forests rather than at sea. And woody biomass is a natural byproduct of ecological forestry anywhere rainfall is adequate, and especially where fire ecologies periodically consume surplus biomass. So thinning of dense regrowth increases wildfire resilience, improves forest amenity and maturity for future generations. And in the process, it generates large amounts of small diameter, low grade wood. And having uses for that wood incentivizes the work of thinning. Biochar is one such product. Multiple benefits include increased water and nutrient holding and microbial activity in agricultural soils. And in the process, biochar sequesters carbon more permanently than traditional organic farming techniques, and thus has potential to play a major role in reversing dangerous climate change. Now, the process of making biochar releases volatile energy, and wood gasification technology can capture this otherwise wasted energy and use it to create electricity, provide heating and power vehicles. And perhaps the greatest sticking point in the widespread application of this technology is the understandable fear that forests and other sources of biomass will be hoovered up, turning yet another renewable technology into an ever larger cause of ecological destruction. So it's globalized capitalism pursuing real and imagined economies of scale, unconstrained by nature's limits. That's the real threat, not the technology. Our own small efforts at sustainable forestry over the last 25 years at Fryers Forest Eco Village here in central Victoria are set to take the next step beyond sustainable yields of honey, durable post timbers and firewood. And this will make use of chipped tree thinnings and heads for wood gasification with biochar byproduct. Our project aims to demonstrate important applications of gasification technology on land adjacent to the Eco Village. And the first is hybrid wood gas electric vehicles suitable for farm and forest management. We believe the electric conversion of light trucks can avoid the need for massive battery banks. We hope to model a local skill and labour-intensive vehicle retrofit industry rather than just buying more new tech manufactured in China from global corporations. And lastly, to retrosuburbia. Retrosuburbia aims to return to the place where permaculture first took root in the late 1970s. Next slide, thanks. In the suburbs of Australia's cities and regional towns. It uses permaculture thinking to turn the so-called problem of suburbia into the solutions of retrosuburbia by applying the retrofitting paradigm to our homes, gardens, and fundamentally our behaviours. It distills 4 decades of experience in how to live better with less, create abundance, and give the next generation a fighting chance to survive and thrive energy descent futures that are already unfolding. So Retrosuburbia is a book and a website, but it's also a strategy and a network to change the world one household at a time. Next slide. So our efforts at Holmgren Design and Meliodora Publishing in rolling out Retrosuburbia in Australia have had some modest successes. Our online access to the book caught a second wave created by the first Australian COVID restrictions and lockdowns, but our ability to scale up that activism to other countries with similar patterns of residential development and social organisation is still lagging. There are opportunities for many more case studies to join those already documented and celebrated at Retrosuburbia. And our ethical boycott of the corporate-dominated distribution pathways remains a handicap, especially in North America, where vast tracts of suburbia are fertile territory for the rollout of Retrosuburbia. So experience with and plans for these very different projects show how small and slow solutions can stimulate and leverage larger scale change. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was great. I mean, those are all incredible solutions that can be applied at scale. To, again, just to illustrate that we can do this if we can just get the political will and the cultural and economic will to shift the way we do things. So next up is my dear friend, Maddy Harland of Permaculture magazine fame, along with other permaculture publications, hailing from the UK. So Maddy, you can unmute yourself, and sweet. So you have a few minutes to just share what you want to share.
Thank you very much. So something that we've been doing in the last few years, Penny will know, we launched the Permaculture Magazine Prize, which is standing at around £25,000, about $30,000 US a year now. And what we do is we identify projects that are doing potentially really good work in community all over the world. And we award small sums of money, up to most of it up to about $3,000. And this money goes without feasibility studies, without requests for proof of milestones achieved, without financial reporting or indeed or targets. So we're really giving this based on an application and then feedback through our network and really fundamentally trust. And what we're seeking is to see this money recycled within local communities and local economies many times over at grassroots level. And we're funding projects that don't get access to mainstream funding. It's very, very much permaculturally based work. One of our criteria is that the projects are indigenously led or locally led. They proliferate knowledge by offering trainings, teaching, creating demonstration hubs. There's often a very strong element with permaculture techniques relating to home gardening in the place that they're offered. Often our candidates are doing all the things you'd expect of permaculturists where appropriate in the world. So mulching, building swales, saving open pollinated seed, creating plant and tree nurseries, and sharing that knowledge with their local communities. And the reason why this is so good at scaling is because it works so well. I was talking to a friend of mine, Steve, from Sector 39. He was saying he spoke with someone that was part of this really basic home gardening movement who went from eating one meal a day with her family to 3. And it transformed their immune systems, their nutrition. It has an effect on the economy of families, so kids can stay in school longer. It's so simple and yet so effective. And obviously there are other dimensions to it, like trainings in fuel efficient stoves built from mud and cob and scrap metal, like rocket stoves, reducing deforestation, saving hours gathering wood, stopping the sort of diseases from using too much kerosene and smoke-filled huts as well. Rainwater harvesting, and as I said, training hubs. And with the magazine, we're building on collaborative partnerships. So with people like Lush, that David recently was a judge of the Lush Spring Prize, we're working with Lush to scale up our Permaculture Magazine Prize and have the benefit of their big network and Buckminster Fuller network as well, and offer a Permaculture Prize specific category within the Lush Spring Prize. So having that sort of collaboration. And then, you know, to a certain extent, it's permaculture, but we don't always have to kind of brand it as such. So there's a lot of work going on through the permaculture movement with agroforestry resource centres, again, citing plant nurseries and spaces for testing out innovation in agriculture, community organising and climate change adaptation. And these are often independent charities, making them not-for-profits, ideally with gender balanced boards and locally run and locally staffed. And they comprise of physical buildings, kitchens, accommodation, offices, bathrooms, classrooms, indoor and out, with all surrounded by demonstration plots, with water harvesting ponds, greenhouses, trees, kitchen gardens. And the idea is to host regular trainings for local farmers on various agroforestry and agroecology techniques and methods, intercropping, layering, harvesting high-value crops like coffee, cacao, almonds, moringa, hazels, depending on the climate. But the emphasis is farmer-led, and then the idea of moving this out and creating satellites. And this is going on in Nepal through Himalayan permaculture. You could say that Chris Nesbitt, working out of Belize, is doing very much this kind of work with local Mayan population as well as Belizeans in general. And another thing that's been useful with scaling is to get the Commonwealth, which is comprised of 54 nations, involved with the idea of regenerative development. This is a bit of a stealth technique that people like Albert Bates, myself, Ben Haggard, Daniel Val, May East have been working on, a bit like putting a Trojan horse in the establishment to strengthen the ideas of permaculture design and embedding that in systems and project examples so that there's a coherence rather than just a set of really good projects. And that has been adopted at Commonwealth Secretariat level as a desirable strategy. But besides that, there's in the UK we've been unlanded for 1,000 years. It's been getting worse since 1801. Since the Enclosure Acts. We're a nation of small gardeners, which is fantastic. We struggle to scale up to bigger regenerative farms. Our land is very, very controlled. So something that is becoming more and more important for us is all those community school gardens and trying to scale up into secondary and primary education and get permaculture design into the curriculum. And also to work with organisations like the Land Workers Alliance, which fundraises and buys up parcels of land and then splits them into small holdings, which are then designed and run on a permaculture basis. And then I have to say something about consciousness. How do we scale up permaculture? Well, it has to be about awakening people to the possibilities, to seeing things as systems and not just disparate entities, to thinking long term. And I just want to honour the law of the Iroquois and the 7-generational thinking, which is very hugely influential. And looking at decision making, not on the basis of a 5-year political term, but on the basis of 200 years. So avoiding cultural appropriation by honouring our sources, but looking at this rich culture that is possible for us to return to. Traditionally, foresters in Britain planted for centuries ahead of time, not just 5, 10, 15 years. So when we planted our oak forests that were felled for the Armada, our foresters were thinking in those timescales. And I believe this is an essential dimension of permaculture and fair shares for the unborn generations. In other words, future care. And I think that's a critical way of scaling up our consciousness and our approach to decision making. Thank you.
Wow, Maddy, that was excellent. Thank you so much. You actually brought up some things that I wanted to say at the beginning, like around the headed 7 generations and that. And as a judge on the Permaculture Magazine Permaculture Prize, I just wanted to add too is that when you're giving out 3,000 or 5,000, it's going to places where that amount of money is going to make a huge difference for the projects, and it's amazing. And it's also as to be able to view and just look at all the projects that are going on all over the world is so inspiring. So there's the idea of scaling up where there's millions and billions of people doing good regenerative practices on the places where they live. And then there's also broadacre and larger projects to scale up, and both strategies are needed. And so, Mark, I'd love for you to share some of the work that you're doing in larger scale agroforestry projects and regenerative agriculture.
Well, thank you. Let's have those slides, and we're gonna have to go through these rapid fire. Let's go right to the second one. I somehow got bit by the permaculture bug way back in the 1980s when some crazy guy in Australia released his master's thesis called Permaculture 1. And in there, I read that it was permanent agriculture. So to me, I'm thinking of growing food, and food was grown at scale. And I ended up seeing this movie that had Bill Mollison in it, The Global Gardener, and he said that the aim is to create systems that are ecologically sound and economically profitable. And that line right there transformed me, because if we design systems that are ecologically sound and economically profitable, that's almost like a holy grail of a survival system for humans on this planet. And now we get to work with the social for the rest of it. And as far as scale is concerned, what I think is wonderful is the proliferation of the different interpretations of permaculture and the whole permaculture framework. That alone is its own kind of scale. So the next slide's, much of the design, from Bill Mollison's words, is taken from nature. Maybe the phrase was taken from David Holmgren and used by Bill Mollison. I don't know how that worked. And it can be as simple or as sophisticated as you like. So what I really want to point out, ecologically designed systems that are also economically profitable. Our economy can be based on ecosystems, and ecosystems that are maintaining and increasing in their health. And that's where the design comes from. Next slide. It wasn't until 2002, after a while, that these principles came out in David's book, Pathways Beyond Sustainability. And it's like, aha, all right, fine. Someone's calming down all this crazy stuff that was going all over the place. And he kind of gave a keel to a ship. And these principles have been keystone to my approach to permaculture. And there's one in particular that I want to address today. Next slide. If we look at number 9, use small and slow solutions. Now that could seem to be a little bit of a paradox. Wait a minute, how do we scale up something that's supposed to be small? Well, if you just read what it says, use small and slow solutions, you'll see a couple different approaches of small and slow. Next slide. The whole suburban thing, most people on this planet live in urban suburban areas of 250,000 souls or more. That's where the majority of humans live. And so naturally, that's where more people are going to find out about permaculture than anywhere else. And that's where more of the adopters are going to be. And just because they're space constrained, it's going to be small in size. And so these are different contexts here. And what's interesting about these slides, all of the people in these pictures right here, they're doing permaculture, urban, suburban scale. Everybody still goes and buys their staple foods, whether they're vegetarian, vegan, or bloodthirsty carnivores. They buy their bulk carbohydrates, proteins, and oils from someplace else where they were grown on large scale properties. That's just a fact. And if any of us ate today, we ate from large scale agriculture because there's just not enough room to produce those carbohydrates, proteins, and oils in an urban setting. And so because I interpreted permanent agriculture as farming, farm scale, ranch scale, I decided to take my work to places like this. And I proposed, long time ago, let's do one small, slow change. Let's take all of the degraded land on the face of this planet and then turn it back into this, what it was once upon a time. Let's take our designs from nature. Let's use nature's playbook. We don't have to invent guilds that work together. Nature's done that for however many zillions of years. And she's known how to recover from volcanic eruptions, from meteors smashing down on the planet, and look at the beauty and the abundance and the diversity that comes out of it. All of the fertility that the industrial culture has mined and despoiled was created by natural processes. Next slide. And so, okay, how do I apply this in my own situation? Buy a piece of property in Southwest Wisconsin. What used to be here? What's been here for zillions of years? Next slide. It's the heartland of the oak savanna complex in North America. comprised of oak, chestnut, beech, apples, hazelnut, plums, cherries, peaches, raspberries, grapes, currants, fungi, forage, animals. This is a complete ecosystem. Does anybody recognize anything edible in there? Anything that we can sell? Next slide. So prior to European settlement, it was rich in photosynthetically productive. Let's go through these lightning. It used no fossil fuels. It used no commercial fertilizers, no chemical pesticides, herbicides, no fungicides, not even any tillage. Can we design farming and ranching properties this way? And can we actually produce our staple foods in systems like this? And then can we actually harvest those yields and pay the bills? Next slide. Next. Yes, we can. Unequivocally, yes, we can, because we did. One family can purchase a property, 100% debt financed, and we can convert the farm up above to the farm down below in 15 short years while paying our bills and making a honest, good livelihood, eating some of the best food in the world, collaborating with others for collaborative marketing adventures. And we have restored ecologies. We have so many endangered species running around on that property, families of badgers and weasels and so on. Next slide. One of the things we're going to have to get used to is we all eat from machines. Get over it. It might be horse-drawn, it might be human-powered, it might be steam-powered, biochar, however we work this, or syngas. If we're going to feed 10 billion people, we're going to have to grow massive quantities of food in ecosystems and harvest it. Next slide. And we don't all have to be big farms. We can be small farms, but when we gather together, we now can aggregate our product, process the product at scale, and then ship it to wherever the markets go. For 26 years, I've been a member of the world's largest certified organic farmers cooperative, which is Organic Valley. None of the vegetable farmers for Organic Valley farmed more than 10 or 15 acres at any one point in time. The whole business as a whole is almost a $2 billion business now. There's 2,400 members. That is rural economic development. We can do permaculture to restore the ecology, provide our food, fuels, medicines, and fibers, and restore the local economies. Next slide. And let's go to the last one right there. And so now as restoration agriculture, next slide, that's the final one. We do this design work all around the world. We focus on particular regions where we can get a concentration of the products that we're growing in these systems. That allows us to invest in the infrastructure for the processing, the value-added products, and the farm families own every single step of the value chain all the way up. We're working on it where eventually we'll own pieces of the retail stores where they're eventually sold, but the trucking company, the aggregation company, the processing company, marketing company, et cetera. And that's kind of what I'm involved in, and one of the reasons why I'm over here in Germany today.
Wow, Mark, thank you. That was so inspiring. I was just getting like bubbles of excitement listening to you, because I know from my own experience and what I've witnessed, you're not exaggerating. I mean, this is really that doable, everything that you're talking about. And I also loved when you were talking about how the earth can regenerate herself. And I've seen it. I just took a drive around Mount St. Helens where this volcano had exploded, and you wouldn't know it. You couldn't tell. Everything is just so back in balance after just probably about, I don't know how long ago it was, but a couple of decades. So thank you for that excellent presentation. So now we're going to jump into some questions, and I'm gonna frame a question for one of the panelists, but if there's time, we don't have a lot of time per question, but it would be great if others could pipe in if they have something to say. But we'll get through as many questions as we can during this time. So the first question is for David, and it's the question is, what do you think needs to happen to scale up permaculture that might not be happening now, or that could happen more than it is?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that Maddy talked about, the becoming what I call agent of positive influence through other networks, and that collaboration between equal networks, but also working up into existing structures rather than needing to necessarily create new structures. I think that's really important. I think the other thing is to recognize the rate of change, and a lot of that change being chaotic and emergent. And I think the pandemic and the responses to it have made it clear to a lot of people that plans and very sort of concrete, locked in approaches can be just swept sideways by events. And I don't think that's likely to change. And at one level, that makes it difficult to plan, but it requires that flexibility that come with actually small scale adaptive systems. And of course, with diversity of strategies, so many permaculture principles help us deal with that random processes that we don't know what's happening next.
Okay, Mark,
While maintaining the long-term view, the 7 generations.
Nice. Well, turn your mute. You need to unmute yourself.
Just adding to what he said, at all levels of scale, whether it's from urban to suburban to rural, large size aquatic systems, to actually, as permaculturists, stand up and solve real problems for real. If we have a need for food, if we have a need for medicine, if we have a need for clean up this or clean up that we actually stand up and we show that we can do it.
Nice, nice. Sweet. Well, the next question is for Maddy. So what's the media's role in scaling up permaculture?
Oh, interesting. I mean, we've got so much going on with the media. So, I mean, first of all, it's a democratization of media. So, you know, in the bad old days, you had the Daily Telegraph owned by a member of the House of Commons. But since digitalization of media, anyone can write, print and publish, particularly with the birth of the internet. So the media is unbelievably powerful. It really is a tool. It can be the knife that stabs you in the back, or the knife that carves and whittles the most beautiful artifact. And it depends on how we use it and how responsible we are. So, you know, media-wise, we've got individuals, we've got groups and small companies that can engage like never before. We've got an incredible access to new technology that we need to use appropriately, especially things like social media, which has been incredibly powerful. You look at YouTube as a phenomenon. We have a YouTube channel. We've had nearly 5 million views on our YouTube channel since we started it. We haven't even really focused on it because we're book and magazine publishers. So I have friends who've got YouTube channels who've got millions of viewers who are permaculturists. And this has a huge influence. It's seeded a no-dig gardening revolution, particularly in the UK. We have ebooks, we have free downloads, we have mobile phones, we have a booming mobile phone network all over Africa, for example. And it's become a means of teaching permaculture design courses through that technology, using existing resources, you know, good quality YouTubes and other digital resources at incredibly low cost and often for free, which again democratizes education and makes it incredibly accessible to pass on knowledge without needing to be trapped in expensive models. In the UK, we have an independent news collective that supports each other, that is completely independent, not controlled by any corporate funding. And what happens is the corporate, as things like climate change becomes headline news, what we find is that the broadcast companies, the corporate broadcast companies, actually plunder our content and use us as a sort of research mechanism for then putting out programs and information about permaculture projects and people. So we often publish something in Permaculture magazine and find that the BBC are making a programme on it a few months later. So media's here to build networks. The alternative media is here as a voice, and a voice of protest as well. For instance, at COP26, there were 503 delegates who were lobbying from the fossil fuel industry. Now, they had more representation than a single country. That's what we're up against. And smaller countries like Guatemala have, 25% of that many lobbyists. So the media needs to be there and use any channels possible to expose what's going on in the world. And it's very much like the 19th century novel, our Dickens, if you like, exposed terrible social inequality and the hypocrisy of Victorian morals. Well, I believe that the media is here to expose the corporate lies that are going on in the world, and also to tell the good news stories. Because when you turn on mainstream media, it's all murder and sensation and drama and misery and jeopardy. Or it's greenwash, swampies are going to save the world and the next green activists are our bankers, and all this kind of total and utter nonsense. And we need to be there as permaculture media to question all of this, but also to tell the other stories, to tell the stories of all the incredibly successful projects all over the world that are transforming people's lives at grassroots for very, very little money. It's really about information and sharing and community. That's, the other dimension of the real world that we need to be talking about. So that's what I think the media is all about.
Yeah, well said. I want to applaud you. That was great. Yeah, you just nailed it. Thank you for that. And and I would like to see more of these on mainstream media too. But I hear what you're saying about plundering our content. The next.
We don't mind having our content plundered if it gets out to 1 million people.
Exactly.
We'd just like them to pay us research fees occasionally.
Yeah, that would be nice. That would be nice. So Mark, a question for you is, what are some strategies that you know about for people getting access to large tracts of land?
Oh boy, that's a 4-hour presentation.
I know.
But I just wanted to quickly comment with Maddy. I was looking for images for my presentation, and one of the slides that I used on my presentation, I took that photograph. I found it on an Indiana public television program. They used my slide on one of their programs. So you're exactly right with stealing that. So what are some of the things for access for land? It ties right into some of the strategies that we need to employ to scale up. Is we have to work with others. People are going to have to learn, whether they're young people or old folks, that you're not necessarily going to be able to do this on your own. You may actually have to borrow money, and doing it with others and or borrowing money, neither of those are bad things. You have to figure out who to partner with, how to partner with them, so you can actually gain access to land. Some of the things that we're working with is we actually organized investors that purchase pieces of property that's set up as a limited partnership with a number of shares that own that property. And then the farmers that come in, they can start buying into the ownership of the property. And then if, say, a carpenter is working on the site, or a stonemason is also operating their business from the site, or a nursery operating from the site. So the real estate becomes more like a shopping mall, and each individual person or family that comes in, they're like the individual stores in the shopping mall. They all build out their part of the asset, and it improves the overall value of the asset. All design permaculture principles, all perennial agricultural production systems, and the associated shops and businesses with that. So that's one of the strategies that we're employing. But the big message that I wanted to bring to that is we have to work with others. If you are unable to gain access to land yourself. It doesn't have to be your land. There are, I think the majority of farmers now are like 70 and older, not like in their 60s and older. And in the next 10 years, I think there's like 60% of America's farmland is going to turn over to somebody. Well, who are the big people buying it right now? There's this country over on the other side of the ocean called China that's buying much of Americans' farmland. There's a gentleman who invented some kind of silly little computer. He's buying farmland along rivers. Why? How about communications and transportation, the most fertile ground? So if we don't stick together, gather together, and start purchasing agricultural properties, put them near a core nucleus, produce enough to actually feed ourselves and generate a surplus for sale and trade and create a real community in an area. If we don't start doing that now, we might find ourselves just, slaves in another penal colony, even if it is pretty and green.
That's a powerful message. Yeah, and I also you're working within the system, I know a lot of people are trying to, get the whole landowning system, abolish that, but it is what we have right now. And so, be able to have the permaculturists and indigenous people getting access to their land so they can steward it in a good way.
And if you can find me a different economy than this one, please let me know.
I know, exactly. I'm with you. So for David, here's a question for you. What changes have in the last 5 to 10 years have occurred that you know about around scaling up permaculture?
Yeah, well, just picking up on what Mark said there about other people owning land and just a land title being just a piece of paper with a signature on the bottom of it, and partnering with those people who already own the land is, while it can be difficult, that I think is a more positive pathway than thinking about partnering with a corporation owning that land. At least you're dealing with a natural person who is subject to moral influence. And this is one of these problems of how we work together and work as equals, but accepting different power relationships rather than trying to actually operate as individuals with these non-natural structures called corporations, and that those corporations need to come back under control of people in different ways. So I think that larger reform process is still awaiting us. But I think one of the big changes in the last 5 years is the acceleration in what I would call the ongoing historical collapse of the middle class in the long affluent countries. And as someone who's devoted my work to trying to bring about change amongst the global middle class, that's actually been a bit of a difficult agenda, given that, as a mass population, we've gained the privileges of that, and cheap food, cheap energy has inhibited the positive action to really do stuff. And as that complacency is falling away, as people's circumstances are tragically, in many ways, getting worse and through very corrupt systems, but that is having the byproduct that at least a proportion of people are galvanized to do something real, get serious about the future, and be more focused on what is needed at a personal level, a household level, a community level, rather than assuming that those larger structures will always provide our needs. And I think that is accelerating across a lot of countries' interest in permaculture and related kindred networks.
I just wanted to say, David, that little summary at the end just gave me goosebumps. And so when permaculturists get real and we all step up, and if we can't supply somebody with that, we help to teach them to do it themselves. And we need some people spreading the word and telling it, broadcasting it far and wide. So we need our media speakers on that side, and everybody stand up in the breach and really solve our problems and not count on these outside structures to take care of us.
Nice. Yes, excellent. Well said. So the next question is for Maddy. Here's one for you. So what are some of the barriers that are obstacles that are to scaling up permaculture, and how do we overcome them?
Well, I've mentioned one, which is that great big lobby of fossil fuel industries. So I won't go back to that, but obviously it's very much on my mind because it's the week of COP26 and it's yet another conference that is watered down and not really, despite the beyond urgency, doing anything about it. So our politics are still utterly flawed. What else do we need? We need to invest in our next generations. So we have something called the Youth in Permaculture Prize, which is now collaborating with Lush. There's Permayouth coming out of Australia and seeding itself all over the world, encouraging much younger people into permaculture and permaculture education. But we need to create a culture that mentors and understands succession in terms of people and not just habitats. Often permaculturists are just doing their best, swimming against the tide to survive. And somehow we've got to get past that survival strategy and go much more into investing in succession planning and involving many more dimensions of generations and diversity. We need to get permaculture far more embedded in schools and universities. It's still, it is in universities and it is taught in schools, but not enough, and not enough all over the world. There are examples like La Ferme du Bec au Halouin in northern France that works with the University of Liège in Belgium and the Institute Silva, which is recording all its carbon sequestration levels of different forms of their growing systems brilliantly, and it's got all that academic weight to it, proving the success of the system. But we need much more of that. David's mentioned marine permaculture and Brian von Hersen, which is brilliant work. We need to also scale up things like replanting mangrove swamps. Amma's organisation in Kerala in India is working with permaculturists to not only develop farms, but do lots and lots of coastal restoration to be more resilient towards tornadoes. Climate change, we're going to have refugees in their millions. We know we are. We need to get ready for it. And we need to get ready now. So the work of permaculture refugees, which has begun with Rosemary Morrow, that is being taken around the world, is immensely important. And all the permaculture design thinking around disaster management. And then the last thing I'll say is diversity. When I first started hanging around in permaculture circles in the early 90s, there were no women teachers in the UK. If you went to a convergence, there was no childcare. It was a boys' club. It's much, much better now. There are, women authors, women teachers, women leaders. That's beginning to even out. But when we look at this panel, let's speak the unspeakable. We're all white. Mm-hmm. And permaculture is perceived as a white middle-class movement globally. It isn't. It isn't in many countries of the world. It's incredible. We have amazing indigenous leaders and people of colour working all over the world doing brilliant things. In Europe and North America, it needs more representation, and we need to make a conscious effort for gender diversity. And I want to tell you, one of the difficulties, if we publish a magazine with a person of colour on the cover, we sell less copies in stores around the world. That is the reality financially. to a small fringe publisher. It's a horrible world, but it's not going to
That's
stop us. It's
That's
not
really
going to stop us. And we've got to keep working on inclusion, not only racial, but we've also got to look at non-binary inclusion in permaculture. Not everyone is a nuclear family in the conventional sense. And of course, you know, decolonization, I think that even goes down to our permaculture principles. I mean, David did an amazing job sort of harnessing the wildness of the permaculture creative global thought process and distilling it into these principles. We need to just continue to evolve, though, and I've been very impressed by Sarah Quablatin in the Philippines, a Philippine young permaculturist who's working with a lot of indigenous people and is beginning to clarify a process that she's calling Principle Zero, which is all about referencing the land and our home as the starting place, and particularly when working with indigenous people, giving, you know, that oral tradition and the floor to say, right, we've come to learn from you. It's not just we've come to teach you permaculture.
Absolutely.
So her Principle Zero is very much inviting local people to share their knowledge relating to their ecosystem first before we go along and observe and interact. And so that is the sort of meta observance principle carrying on there. And of course, Australians and North Americans often acknowledge the original custodians of the land that they live in as part of self-introduction. There's also a growing movement to recognise the rights of nature, giving it a voice and a role for its protection and a place within our design. Are we listening to the sentient beings in our design?
Oh, Maddy, that's beautiful. Thank you. You said a lot. You said so much. There is going to be a panel on Saturday called Permaculture and Indigenous Approaches to Land Management, and it will feature Carmen Gonzalez, who's Navajo, and Bill Tripp, who's Karuk. And so that's on Saturday. So, but absolutely about diversity, and you really nailed it. And I do want to acknowledge there are some amazing indigenous permaculture teachers out there. And I worked deeply with a lot of Quechua and Q'ero people in Peru. I got stuck there during the pandemic, and they are teaching it, and they're running with it. They're transitioning to organic and adopting permaculture and teaching each other. So it is happening, but it needs to happen more, definitely.
And in Europe.
Yes, definitely.
You know, it happens in South America, it happens in Africa, but I'm speaking as a European. There is not enough diversity in Europe.
Yes, definitely.
And I live in a multicultural society, but you'd never know.
Right. Yes, good point. Excellent. So the next question is for Mark. So what are some of the economic issues, and you can also address some of the economic benefits that you've experienced in these regenerative agricultural projects? But you know, what kind of issues are you facing, and what are, you know, some of the benefits?
Some of the issues that I face is a lot of people who might be interested in getting into agriculture say, oh, I want to buy a farm. And then they think that the growing of the crops is going to pay for everything. And then they struggle and they work and they do all kinds of things and they suffer. In the US anyways, the average tenure in organic agriculture, market gardening is about 5 years. And then people just quit, they're broke, they're burned out, they can't do it. Well, one of the things is you have to understand that basically nobody's making any money in agriculture. Over here, I'm in Germany. In Europe, everybody is subsidized. All the farmers are subsidized. In the USA, of course, it's not a subsidy. It's called an insurance program. It's just they just reworded the whole thing. One of the challenges is to show folks that your little IRS Schedule F farm is one entity on this overall system, and we need to design a system of real estate ownership, agricultural production, other business activity, run it all as a business that way, and then to partner with other investors, a retiring farmer, and so on. So one of our challenges is convincing people that your little cucumber market garden isn't going to pay all the bills, and you're not going to crush it and make six figures overnight. What was the second part of your question?
Oh, just what are some of the benefits?
Oh, some of the benefits. Like, for example, what's really interesting is there's all this talk about, we got to collaborate, cooperate, et cetera. The world is really more cooperative instead of competitive. But how many people actually have worked within and lived within a collaborative, cooperative enterprise for their whole entire adult life? I'm a 26-year member of the Organic Valley Cooperative. I own a piece of the company that sells my products. I own a piece of the trucking company that transports my products. I own a piece of the meat company that sells chickens and eggs. And then as a group, we get to purchase products in bulk if we need, some calcium inputs or seaweed. The wind turbine that powers my farm, there were 6 or 7 of us that we all pooled together and we bought wind turbines in bulk. Same thing with photovoltaic panels. So the benefits of working within a collaborative venture are just phenomenal, but it takes a while before those benefits start to show up. So the early years, it just seemed like it was all work and lousy pay. But then all of a sudden, the power of having all these neighbors around us who are part of the same system, selling similar products and supporting one another, it just became overwhelming. And there is somewhat of a myth out there that, but farmers don't cooperate and collaborate anymore like they used to in the old days. Well, they do. I can call up a veterinarian 24/7, no charge, and I get some, free advice about any of my livestock. The
Right.
benefits of working with one another and collaborating, really doing that, being fiercely loyal to one another and to the cause, the benefits are astounding. And one of the things I say over and over again is like, look, I don't have to like you to work with you and to really be fiercely loyal to the same cause, because we are in this together. And if I go down, you go down. If you go down, I go down. So I'm going to help you every step of the way.
That's true about the whole world, actually, with all of creation. We got to be that inclusive. Yeah, I did not know that about Organic Valley, so it's really great to hear what you're saying. So
it's the largest private employer in the southern half of the state of Wisconsin right now.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. So the next question, we're got a few more minutes. So David, what are some of the best practices that you know around retrofitting infrastructure?
Yeah, well, I think this opportunity to adapt what we've already got rather than starting from scratch is a fundamental strategic move. A lot of permaculture design has started with a conceptual blank slate, but if we go back to my retro suburbia paradigm, most of the houses that people will be living in a completely different, changed world, completely different economies, dealing with the knock-on effects of what's happened over the last at least 250 years of industrialization already exist. So retrofitting is the future, not really building new ecological houses like the passive solar house I'm sitting in here. And, that how we then apply that retrofitting paradigm and similarly think of all the gardens that exist around those houses that could be producing the food for people. So that makeover, that retrofitting, that adapting what already exists. And sometimes that involves radical changes and losses and cutting losses in something, but also extending that to really retrofitting our behavior, because that is the really big one for global middle class people, who represent really, when we get down to it, the engine of global destruction. The rich don't really, they have a lot of power, but they don't really literally consume enough themselves to make much impact. And as I mentioned in the biomass energy approach, we believe that retrofitting huge numbers of the light trucks and small vehicles that certainly run rural enterprises in places like the United States and Australia, rather than the fact that we're going to throw all those away and then buy some new tech from China, is a big mistake at multiple levels. And the idea that we can use new technology and adapt existing vehicles, as this example that we're talking about of hybrid wood gas and electric vehicles, is something that is technology which is amenable to being dealt with at the moderate scale, rather than putting all our eggs in the basket of we will be totally dependent on clean room manufacturing from China, mediated by global corporations.
Yes.
So adapt and retrofit what we have is so often the way forward.
Definitely, definitely. Yeah, and it's interesting because I moved into the suburbs, and I love the idea of growing food where it's being consumed, and you just save on transportation. And I've set up I'm making a very beautiful garden that is so abundant with, herbs and berries and flowers and fruit trees. And so now I have 2 years into this, I have so much abundance. I'm giving fruit to my neighbors. One of my neighbors had never tasted a fresh strawberry picked off of he'd never tasted a strawberry like that. And so it's my form of education around my neighbors by simply doing it. And I think it'll inspire them to start retrofitting their places too. So the next question is for Maddy. What are some successful models you know about?
Well, I thought about this. I thought, well, I'm going to take you to a little journey to a woodland on the Sussex Downs. It's Ben Law's woodland. He owns just 7 acres, but he looks after 200 acres or so around him. And for the last nearly 30 years, he's been restoring a broadleaf woodland and bringing a chestnut coppice into production again. He's been very focused on biodiversity and habitat restoration. He has nightingales and silverwash fritillaries and all sorts of beautiful wildlife. Part of his place is actually a nature reserve. It's called a triple SI. It's a special site of scientific interest. He does 7 generational traditional planting. So he's planting for 200 years hence, not just for his great grandchildren, but beyond. He's developed all sorts of valued added products. So he's got agroforestry areas. He builds garden structures from his timber. He has fruit, bespoke furniture, food systems, mushroom logs. He makes perry from his fruit crops, and he's got honey as well. He's pioneered roundwood timber framing in Britain, using wood in the round instead of trying to get people away from using green oak, which takes hundreds of years to grow, using instead things like Douglas fir, western red cedar, and of course chestnut for things like shingles on roofs. He's actually changed English planning law by fighting for a silvicultural planning permission that allows him to live in his woodland. Previously, our sort of sense of forestry is industrial scale, and only industrial scale forestry is economically viable. He's proved the opposite, that small forest systems can work. But I think the most important thing about his work is when he went into forestry as a very young man, the traditional foresters didn't like sharing knowledge with outsiders, but he'd actually been in the Amazon learning around with timber framing and other techniques. And the local people, the First Nation people there, were so utterly generous with sharing their knowledge and teaching him. So he vowed to change the sort of British forestry model. And as soon as he was able, he started to invite young apprentices to spend 6 months in the wood learning everything that he could teach them. And he has 3 a year. It doesn't sound many, but over 20 odd years, they've seeded out, they've started their own projects, they've taken on their own apprentices. And what's happened is it's created a small wood renaissance in Britain that has been good for biodiversity, great for community projects, economically viable, and permaculturally based. And he's proved that poly-income systems work really well. And and because of his work in the media as well, on TV and as an author, he's introduced literally millions to the potential of small mixed woodlands as havens for biodiversity, value-added products, and low-impact living.
Nice. Sweet. That's beautiful. Yeah, that's so inspired. And it also inspired, there's a YouTube video that people can watch called Shipibo Permaculture. And it's a video made by a Shipibo man named Limburg Cabrera. And it actually shows, I think it was supported by Lush, but it just shows this whole integrated system like you're talking about, indigenous style. So we have time for just a couple minutes, Mark, for last question. You probably won't be able to answer this in the time we have, but what's your, I'm interested in your personal experience around managing this large land, like how do you do it? But
here's
2 minutes.
interesting tidbit is my dad's family, last name Shepard, obviously that comes from the UK. They were coppice woodlot foresters. And when they emigrated to the States, that's how they did forestry. So I was raised, my dad and his dad and so on all the way back, this is what we've always done. And so I thought that was normal. And so how do I manage such a large property? Think about what I said earlier in the slides. It's a mimic of a natural ecosystem. Who took care of that Mount St. Helens property for you? Nobody did anything to it. It's all there. It's being taken care of itself. So I treat it by harvesting. When it's time to harvest this crop, I make sure that I'm harvesting in such a way that it's setting up for the next one. Then I'll come up and harvest this one and set up for the next one. If I do any just like random work, it's when I'm selecting material and I'll cut some trees down to give more light to some other elements in the system. And I'm making saw logs, firewood, mushroom logs. So Maddy told my story when she's talking about Ben Law. That's how you manage a larger system like that. And because it is a natural ecosystem, you can use livestock to manage it and use your own personal labor. But every time I'm doing something, I'm actually producing a yield or a secondary product or another fertility amendment and so on. And so another thing that helps is to not treat let's just take apple production, right? If you do everything,
we got 1 minute.
If you do everything that the apple orchardists tell you to do, it takes so much time, it's ridiculous. If you treat apples as another tree and kind of treat them like a forester would, you'll still get apples. You'll still get plenty of them. You'll get cider, you get perfect fruit, and then you can have feed for the pigs afterwards. Wow. So how Ben Law is managing his woodlot, that's how we manage a farm. He's farming a coppice woodlot.
Well, and also another vision in this is creating all these different livelihoods. So you've got the fruit tree person, and you've got the beekeeper, you've got the timber person, you've got people actually working the same land in an integrated way with multiple livelihoods.
There was a woman named Alice who harvested There was a woman named Alice who harvested medicinal herbs from my property for about 10 years. And I only
Nice.
saw her twice. And she, you know, she
Wow.
always comes in and harvests her things. Oh, look, Alice has been here. This is gone. So,
Wow, you guys. Well, this is great. We're at time, and what a great panel and what you contributed. And I hope it's inspired the people watching. And I just want to thank you so much for showing up and sharing your knowledge and your wisdom with everybody. So thank
Thanks,
you.
Penny.
Thank you so much for
For hosting us.
inviting
Yes.
Thank you, everybody.
us.
Yes.
And great to see you again, Maddy, and great to meet you, Mark, for the first time.
Nice. Great.